Last time on the Skip and Josh podcast.
Obviously, we're all accustomed to this new normal, right? You know, first there was no sports at all. Then after 4 or 5 months, sports came back, but it was different. No fans in the stands and not as many games as we're used to seeing. And what bugs me is the NBA is planning to hold an all-star game this year. This, to me, is the most backwards thing I've ever heard.
You're listening to the Skip and Josh podcast with Skip Sherman and Josh Obadia.
Okay, Skip, so today we're going to talk about our favorite podcasts, but before we get to that, I want to tell you about a couple of television shows that I started watching recently. Actually, it's not even recently, and not only have I started watching them, but I finished watching them.
Wow.
So, and I don't think, one of them you told me about, actually. It's a show called Unbelievable that was on Netflix.
Oh, that's fantastic.
It is fantastic. I'm glad you told me about it. It's, I think everyone should watch it. It was very good, very educational. It made me angry, which means it's a good show.
Mm-hmm.
And it was actually, didn't take me long to watch it. I think it's only 1 season, 8 episodes, right?
Yeah. I think that show was like my number one show when we did our year-end episode of 2018 or 2019, whatever year it was.
Yes, I think you mentioned that. Yes. Anyhow, so that's a good show. And the other good show that I watched recently is it's an Amazon Prime show called The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel.
How many seasons?
So there's currently 3 seasons, and I guess there's going to be a 4th, but obviously they're behind because of COVID. But I was able to watch 3 seasons in about 3 weeks or so.
So you like it?
Yeah, it's a fun show. I one of the few shows lately that actually makes me laugh out loud, first of all. I mean, there's funny shows like the Goldbergs and stuff, but, you know, I don't usually actually laugh out loud. But
right.
Actually, my favorite character on The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, or my favorite actor, is Tony Shalhoub. I know he's been in a million things.
Oh, yeah.
But he's really funny in this.
I think I wanted to watch it many times, but it's like a time investment. When I see a show that already has 3 seasons, I'm like, oh God, I got to watch 3 seasons. You know, it's like a little bit daunting.
Right now, I have nothing but time.
Yeah.
And also, the other thing was I only had Amazon Prime for free for 30 days. So I had to I literally had to binge watch the whole thing. So anyway, it was a good show. I enjoyed it. And I don't know how I'm going to watch season 4 when it ever comes out, but that's that. Do you have any listener mail? We haven't spoken in a while.
Mailbag.
Yeah, we've been on a little mini hiatus. Took a couple weeks off. But yeah, no, I do have some listener mail. It seems like forever ago that we did our last episode, which was, I had to remember what the last episode was. It was our favorite quarterbacks. So it's like, which was timed with the Super Bowl, like the Super Bowl, Josh. It seems like last year already. It seems so long ago.
It does. It was a terrible game, by the way.
Oh, God, awful. So, listener mail. Of course, friend of the show, Jesse from Texas, he sent us his list of quarterbacks. He actually sent it before the episode aired.
Let me guess, are they all Dallas Cowboys?
Well, he's got Dak Prescott, Troy Aikman, and Roger Staubach in his list.
How much longer is Dak Prescott going to be on Dallas?
I don't know. He wasn't not long. Although they have to franchise him, and he's going to get paid a hell of a lot of money.
Right.
You know, so I don't know what's going on there. It's not a good situation. He's also got Drew Brees, Matt Stafford, Joe Montana, Archie Manning on his list. So fun list from Jesse. And then actually the other listener mail, it came to you and you forwarded them to me via text screenshots.
I printed them out and I drove them over to your house.
Exactly, yeah. So Jeff from Montreal messaged you saying he's really enjoyed our show lately, especially the Springsteen episode. And he mentioned that he listens while on the treadmill. And in the same vein, you know, of what people are doing while they're listening, because we already know friend of the show, Derek, who writes to us often, he always tells us that he listens while ironing.
It's a good way to pass the time.
Yeah, so Jeff is using the treadmill while listening, and a buddy of yours, Mitch, in Toronto, said he dozed off listening to our show, which, you know, that's another sleeping, you know, napping. That's another activity.
Our podcast is a better sleeping aid than drugs, because our podcast is safer than drugs.
That's right. And then we got an interesting message from your brother and indirectly your niece, right? So Sam and Naomi. So they discovered that you can listen to our show on the Amazon Alexa. So now your niece, Naomi, says we're famous.
That's right. We are.
So if she can get her uncle on the Alexa, that's a big deal. So
this is true.
That's the listener mail. Yeah.
You can just say, play the Skip and Josh podcast, and then next thing you know, you'll hear our voices.
Right. So it's amazing that you started the show with like a couple of TV shows you're watching, because there was some big news in sports here in Montreal with the firing of the coach. I was so sure that you were going to talk about the Canadiens coaching situation. But I mean, I guess it's like, it's already old news. No, it's like a few days old. So.
It is old news. And I mean, it's, as surprised as I was, it wasn't really shocking because like really he could have been fired a year ago, and he probably should have been fired a year ago because didn't they have like 2 8-game losing streaks last year?
Yeah. I know when people ask me like how come they fired him so quickly? Like what was this reason? I'm like, well, they had these losing streaks last year that they could never get out of, and I think the GM was just like, we can't go through that again. So I mean,
I have to say that whole situation last year with the expanded playoffs and the bubble, that actually I think hurt the Montreal Canadiens, because what happened is they did well in the bubble, and so I think the management thought that the team is better than it really actually is, and the coach is actually better than he actually is. And so that basically gave him, a little bit more rope, because if they didn't make the playoffs, he may have been fired in the offseason. And then not only that, if they didn't make the playoffs, they might have had they would have had a better draft pick also. But I think that they would have been better off not making the playoffs last year.
Right. I just find it funny. I just find the whole thing amusing because, so basically they lose to Ottawa because of 2 things. Carey Price can't even stop like a peewee level hockey shot.
Right.
Like not even a shot. I don't even know what it was. He let in a goal that no NHL goalie should let in. And they call back a goal that we scored in the last 2 seconds. Right. So, and I'm not debating whether that goal should be called back or not, whatever. All I'm saying is like, so if Gallagher's goal counts, does that mean he doesn't get fired the next day? Or if Carey Price stops that shot, and I'm holding up air quotes, does that mean he doesn't get fired the next day? Like, I just find the timing always so weird.
He probably wouldn't get fired because I don't know that a coach has ever been fired after a win. But, so let's say they won that game, he doesn't get fired, but then they go and lose the next game to Winnipeg, which they did anyway. Then he probably would have been fired after that. He probably would have been fired after the next loss, regardless of when that loss came.
Right. I agree. Anyways, I just find it funny how these things operate. And again, we don't want to go like 10, 20 minutes on the Canadiens, which we probably could.
I'll just finish off. Yes, they lost to Ottawa by a goal because of a controversial call and because of a misplay by Carey Price. But the bottom line is, when you're playing a team like Ottawa, I'm not saying you should beat them 8-0, but it shouldn't even come to that. It shouldn't come to the point where one call by a referee is going to cost you the game. The Canadiens, if they're planning on making the playoffs and having a long run, should be good enough to beat Ottawa by multiple goals.
Yes, correct. I mean, look, when you're playing the same teams over and over, there's this sort of playoff effect where the games tighten up sometimes. But yes, if they think they're a playoff team, they need to beat Ottawa consistently. That's a given. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, look, we do a podcast, and we love listening to podcasts, right?
Yes.
Hence the topic of our favorite podcast. Tell me, like, I'm always interested to know, Josh, how extensive was your research? How long did it take you? Like, was this complicated? Like, how did it work?
So, when I first suggested this topic, I thought it was going to be easy, but things have happened in the last couple of weeks, and I'm reassessing my entire life. Especially
your whole life.
Well, I'm reassessing my podcast playlist, let's just say.
Right.
So if you ask me to do this list, 6 months from now, it's going to be completely different. But I did this list trying to ignore the last couple of weeks.
Okay, I know where you're going, because we have a podcast that we both listen to that I'm sure is on both our lists, and we have different feelings about it recently because it's not as good. But but that brings up the topic of sort of like the recency. Like, I looked through all the podcasts that I subscribe to, and there's a lot of them. And I was like, have I been really subscribing to all these for this many years? Like, like there are some that I've been listening to years and years, right? That I've been going on forever. But there's some that are fairly new. And I was trying to remember, like, what podcast that I listened to 3 years ago that maybe I don't listen to anymore. Is it like, and it's just hard to sort of remember and think back. But like, so I know you mentioned last time that you could include podcasts on our list that maybe don't exist anymore.
Right.
Or maybe that you don't listen to anymore, but at the time you did.
Yes.
So I don't know. I think it should be fun to go through our list of podcasts. I have a whole bunch of honorable mentions. Can I start with those, or do you want to? Or
well,
do you have
before you
honorable
mention
mentions?
those, I'm just going to say one other criteria. So there is a podcast that I actually listen to every single day, but it's technically all it is basically there's a television show and they convert it into a podcast. And so I didn't consider that one because it's not really a podcast. It's actually a television show. So
But that's PTI, right?
yes. So I didn't put that on my list, even though I listen to it every single day.
Oh, you just prefer to consume it in that format because sometimes you can't watch. Maybe.
Well, I don't get TSN anymore, so I can't watch it.
Even better.
But I mean, it's technically all they do is record the show and put it in a podcast format. It's not really a podcast.
Sure.
So I didn't. So this list, my list, is not which podcast you listen to the most. It's not that.
No, because there's podcasts that are on my honorable mention that I listen to every day. But that doesn't mean they're my favorite. I just listen to them every day.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
So I don't have any. I don't have any honorable mentions. So you can go ahead with yours.
Okay. So my honorable mentions, I have Front Burner, which is a CBC News podcast. That's the one that I just mentioned. It's a daily. Around the NFL, which is basically an NFL news podcast. It's put on by NFL Network. A show that doesn't exist anymore, but was one of the first podcasts that we ever listened to that I suspect is in your list, which is the Fantasy 411, which is a very, very fun fantasy baseball podcast. The BS Report. I mean, Bill Simmons. Like, look, I have a long history with Bill Simmons. I don't listen to him anymore, but I felt he still deserved an honorable mention because I've been listening to him forever, right? Up until like maybe last year, So 538 Politics, Party Lines, which is also a CBC podcast, which I find very, very interesting. It's a politics style. Reply All, which is something that we've talked about before. And NPR's Planet Money, which is more or less an economics type of podcast, but for everyday people. But I do feel, Josh, I need to give 3 shout outs to my indie podcast buds. Because, as you know, I've been a guest on some other podcasts, so I just want to throw those guys out there. They're all in my honorable mentions. So the Pop Culture Cosmos podcast, run by Gerald Glassford, who's in Las Vegas. I've appeared on that show a few times to talk about basketball, college basketball, NBA. Every now and then he throws in a sports episode, but it's mostly about movies and comic book style, sci-fi, like Pop Culture Cosmos, exactly how the title is. Our first podcast buddy, Matt Sanderson out in British Columbia, who does the Nooks and Crannies podcast with his partner Evan. I don't know how to describe the podcast, so I'm just going to read the actual official description.
The show description, yeah.
Yeah, a lefty social science and political variety show. This is what they bill themselves as. So, for example, during this whole last year up to the election, it was a lot of politics. When I did appear on the show, it was post-election reaction, American election, I should say. But, for example, the most recent episode was about street hockey in Canada, growing up playing street hockey. So the topics vary.
I should have been a guest on that one.
Yeah. Well, it's actually, they combined it. It was street hockey and public drinking. So I don't know how you feel about that, but...
I've only done one of those things.
Right. And then of course, I mentioned him in the listener mail, our friend Jesse in Texas, Set Lusting Bruce, which is a show about Bruce Springsteen, but mostly about his fans. And a special shout out to Jesse. Honestly, I only discovered that show in 2020, and the show was really, it really meant a lot to me in 2020. It really helped get me through the year. Honestly, listening to that show was so enjoyable for me. I just love listening to it. So keep up the good work, Jesse.
Nice. Excellent. Well, your list is a lot longer than mine.
Well, I mean, I really wrote down every podcast that I subscribed to, and then I ranked them.
Number 7.
Okay, so since this was the topic that I suggested, I guess I need to go first.
Uh-huh.
So number 7 for me is, you mentioned it, MLB Fantasy 411 with Mike Ciano and Corey Schwartz. So this probably was the first ever podcast that I ever listened to. And of course, I was big into fantasy baseball at the time. I still do play fantasy baseball now, but I'm not as enthused about it as I used to be, let's say. It was a very good podcast because if you needed information on, who to add, who to drop, who to trade, they always seemed to have the answers, and it was every day. And I sent in some emails sometimes, and there were a couple times where they actually read my email. There was one time where they actually took calls on the show, and they took my calls, so that was pretty cool.
Honestly, Josh, it was such a great show. Like, it really, really was.
It really was.
Also, I agree. I think it was the first podcast that I ever listened to. And think about it, going back, now when you want to download a podcast, they download automatically onto your phone, right? Mm-hmm. But back then, I used to have to download them on iTunes on a computer.
Yes.
And then connect physically with the cable, my phone.
Yeah.
In order to
not your phone, your iPod.
My iPod. Yes, not even my phone, my iPod.
Yeah.
You're right. Sync them to be able to listen. That's how long ago this was.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. They were great because they were just a couple of regular dudes who actually happened to work for MLB and decided to do a podcast. But then slowly but surely it got popular enough that MLB kind of took it over. And that was sort of the demise of it.
Right. Well, one of the guys left. I forget which one. And they replaced him with someone else who was fine, but I mean, it just wasn't the same. And then actually the podcast became a video podcast, which, I mean, that wasn't really necessary because I don't need to see anything. I only need to hear it.
Because it was basically the show that they would do in the MLB studios and they would put it on as a podcast.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Once they got like a professional host, then it went down the drain. Because before that, it was just two guys that happened to work for Major League Baseball that said, hey, we're going to make a podcast. Right. These guys
and
weren't pros. These guys aren't broadcasters.
It seemed like a lot like our show. It wasn't really scripted. They just were talking about baseball and talking about their fantasy teams and talking about which players who might be available in your league that, might be worth picking up and things like that. And so, just the fact that, by the way, it was very difficult for me to call into the show because it's an American podcast and the number they gave out, even though it's a toll-free number, would never work from Canada. So I sent them an email. I said, look, I've been trying to call your show for weeks and I can't get through. And they actually responded and they said, okay, well, we'll try and figure this out. And then I think they gave me a different number to call. And the point being that it eventually worked and I actually got on the show. So it was pretty cool.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Anyways, a lot of great memories of the Fantasy 411. Number 7 for me, Josh, is a podcast that you introduced me to, which is called The Ongoing History of New Music with host Alan Cross. It's a Canadian music show. I'll read you the official description because it's also hard to describe. They call themselves, it is Canada's most well-known music documentary. So it's basically every episode tackles some kind of topic in music, more or less more alt-rock, I would say, right? That's like the genre that they look at. And there's just some great episodes. You really get the whole history of alt-rock music in Canada. Like you listened to the most recent one about CanCon. That was amazing.
It's on my list, but I haven't listened to it yet.
It's so well done. I just really, really loved it. And of course, I've told you that my favorite episode there is the history of radio, which is just great. It's so well done also.
Yeah, when he goes back and talks about like how records were invented.
Yeah, it's so good. But I mean, like we're making it sound like a history podcast. It's not, because there's an episode just devoted to Pearl Jam. There's an episode just devoted to Radiohead. All kinds of stuff. Anyways, it's great. Really well done.
Number 6.
Okay, so number 6 for me is very similar to number 7. The only reason this one is a little bit higher on the list is because number 6 actually still exists, and it's the CBS version of Fantasy Baseball Today.
Who hosts that?
Unfortunately, I don't know the names of the guys because I haven't listened to it recently, but it's very similar to MLB Fantasy 411. I think they do this show every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And there's actually 4 different guys, but they only have 2 at a time. So they basically rotate. And similarly, you can send them emails and ask them questions. And also the other fun thing that these guys do is if there's a trade in your league that you think is not fair, you can send it into them and they will adjudicate whether the trade should be vetoed or not. It's quite funny.
I used to listen to another fantasy baseball podcast. You know, the one with Matthew Berry, Fantasy Focus?
Yep.
And they used to do that too, like for lopsided trades where commissioners could email their grievances and let them decide.
So there's a few times where I've emailed the show and asked them a question about like, should I make this trade or should I make this move? And they don't always respond, but sometimes they've read my emails on their show, which is pretty cool. And again, I was listening to this a few years ago when I was heavily into fantasy baseball, and it's just so much easier than there's so much out there that you can read about fantasy baseball. But when you're on the subway and you're tired, you don't feel like reading, or you might be in the subway in Toronto, you can't really get the internet sometimes because you're underground. But if you download the podcast in advance, you could just listen to it on your way home, and it's so much easier. So it was very convenient, and the fact that it was 3 times a week as opposed to every day, I actually liked that because I didn't want to listen to it every single day. So it was perfect. I really liked it. So, and they still do it. I just don't listen to it anymore.
So number 6 for me, staying with sports, Josh. It's a podcast that I've mentioned a lot on the show from time to time. That's the Sports Reporters. So the Sports Reporters is a podcast hosted by 3 very well-known sports reporters, Mike Lupica, Mitch Albom, and Bob Ryan. And it's just really smart takes on American sports, right? And these guys are smart. They know what's going on. They've been around forever, and I like listening to these guys, so it's just it's like whatever's going on in that week, I think it's twice a week they do it. So, I mean, there was a little too much Tiger Woods this week, but that's just me.
Right. So actually, it's interesting you mentioned that podcast because I had been listening to that podcast religiously, but I'm no longer listening to it as of basically 2 days ago. I've unsubscribed from that podcast partly because of what they talked about on their last episode.
Because of Tiger Woods? And you don't want to say Tiger Woods. It's like you don't even want to say his name. I can tell.
They devoted the entire episode to that one topic that I have zero interest in. Zero.
Right. So that forced an unsubscribe. Wow. Big reaction there.
The truth is, it wasn't just that one episode. It's like, when do you fire the coach after which loss? I mean, it was a collection of things. They talk a lot about the NBA. I don't really care about the NBA. They never talk about hockey. I like hockey. So why do I listen to it?
Yeah, good show. Good show. Anyways, I still like listening to these guys. I like hearing what they have to say.
Number 5.
Number 5 for me, you're going to be surprised that this is not higher on my list. And again, this falls in line with what I said earlier. It's the Tony Kornheiser Show, which is a podcast that I have listened to for at least a decade. And I think same for you. I used to love this show. I used to, listen to it religiously and sometimes rewind things if I missed them because sometimes you miss some jokes. But the reason it's only number 5 on my list is ever since, and it's not really his fault, but ever since the pandemic, they don't do the show every day anymore. They only do it 3 times a week, which, whatever, it's his show. He can do whatever he wants. But it's not so much.
The format's changed. The format's changed because he's at home and he doesn't have his same crew with him,
Right. So, one of the things that I liked in the past about the show is some of the regular guests that he has, like Gary Braun and Chris Saliza, who are really funny guys. And they are hardly ever on anymore, and when they are, they're only on for a few minutes at a time. So the show is not what it used to be. And also, in fairness, Tony's starting to lose it a little bit. It's fine if you have a different opinion.
Old, right?
It's fine if you have a different opinion than me on something. Like, we're not all going to agree on things. But when you actually say things that are factually incorrect, why am I listening to you anymore?
But you haven't unsubscribed from Tony yet.
I have not, but it is not as high on my list as it used to be.
Number 5. I don't know if I ever talked about this with you. Do you know what one of the biggest segments or genres of podcasts is? Do you know
true crime?
True crime, exactly. So I listened to a podcast called Crime Junkie.
Okay.
where basically it's these two ladies, Ashley Flowers and her friend Britt, and they basically talk about like murders. Like they go over like one murder that happened. Sometimes they're solved, sometimes they're unsolved. Sometimes there are cases that go over 20 years until they figure out who did it, and they just talk about it. And like I can't get enough of it. Honestly, I can't get enough. My wife is at the point where she's making fun of me. She's like, "You're listening to new murder every night."
Listen, if there's anyone, I don't know that your wife should be making fun of you, because we know about your wife and her Weather Network, obsession.
Yeah, that's true. So, anyways, Crime Junkies. That's my number 5.
Number 4.
Okay, so interesting, because my number 4, and you may laugh at me for this, and I don't listen to it anymore, but it's Serial. Now, I know that season 2 and 3 of Serial were not good, but season 1 of Serial was pretty amazing.
Well, I'm not going to laugh at you because I have it on my list higher than what you have it.
Okay, so season 1 of Serial, and just because season 2 and 3 were not good, I didn't want to penalize the show, because season 1 was excellent. Might have been the most interesting thing I've ever listened to on a podcast. So it's unfortunate that, they've tried to duplicate season 1. They've never been able to do that. I don't think they are ever going to be able to do that, because the case that they followed in season 1 was just so unique. But season 1 was excellent, so it deserves to be on my list. So it's at number 4.
Nice. Good shot. So number 4 for me is a show that I'd mentioned before. It's called Endless Thread. So this is I'm going to read the actual, again, I'm going to read the official description. Hosted by Ben Brock Johnson and Amory Sievertson. And the podcast delves into Reddit's boundless communities with the help of Reddit and Redditors, exploring some of the most compelling stories the internet has to offer. So basically, like these guys, they find like the most weird and interesting stories on Reddit, and they do a podcast about it, and they interview the people involved, and like they tell interesting stories. So for example, like I'm going to give you my favorite episodes: The Great Mattress Conspiracy, The Mystery of Glitter, to the Max Headroom, which is like how that Max Headroom business started back in the 80s. Another one called Imaginary Friend, which scared the hell out of me. And then the number 1 episode, if you want to start listening to Endless Thread, is called Pile of Plates, which is it's a 2-parter where they're trying to actually find this pile of plates in the middle of a forest, which is like, you have to listen to it to fully appreciate it. It's quite amazing.
Interesting. Okay.
Number 3.
Okay, number 3. So this is another show that's had 2 seasons so far, and I did not like season 2, but I really did like season 1, and it's called Against the Rules with Michael Lewis. Season 1 was about not just referees, like the first episode of season 1 was about referees specifically, but it was basically about anyone in society who adjudicates anything, like a judge or a principal at a school or whatever. The list goes on and on and on. And I really did like season 1. Season 2 was not as good. And, if there is a season 3, hopefully it'll be similar to how season 1 was. But I do like Michael Lewis. I've read a couple of his books, and it was an interesting podcast.
Is season 2 like about coaches? Is that the one?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, no, I like both seasons. Honestly, I like both seasons. I think they're good. Very, very, very solid listen. Actually, especially like you said, season 1, which is really, it's interesting. He has a great way of telling a story. Like anybody who could write a book like Moneyball, right? Which is basically a book about like statistics, baseball statistics,
and make it interesting.
And make it into a story. Like that's a skill, right? Yeah. So number 3 for me, Josh, is something that I know you've never listened to.
Okay.
It's called Binge Mode. Now, Binge Mode it's not divided up in seasons, but there's hundreds of episodes and they're divided up into chunks of topic. So the topic that I'm specifically talking about, and there must be like a good 20 something episodes or more, is Binge Mode Game of Thrones. So the hosts are Mallory Rubin and Jason Concepcion. That's their names. And if anybody is still like hasn't watched Game of Thrones, you should listen to all those Game of Thrones episodes after or while you're watching. if you're a Game of Thrones fans and you missed the show, go listen to the Game of Thrones episodes on Binge Mode. The Mallory Rubin knows more about Game of Thrones than anybody. Like, I don't even understand how she knows so much stuff. It's unreal. And it's just a great listen. Honestly, it's for Game of Thrones fans, it's a must. And I mean, there's other topics that they've covered within the Binge Mode feed. Harry Potter specifically, because she's a crazy Harry Potter person. And now that lately they've been doing Marvel, all the Marvel movies. So anyways, it's fun. Good times. So
by the way, I've never seen 1 minute of Game of Thrones.
I know. You really wouldn't like it. It's totally not up your alley. I know that.
Number 2.
I'm at number 2. And so number 2 for me, I know this is a podcast that you've listened to, and it's called Origins with James Andrew Miller. And the way this show works is there are different, not necessarily seasons, but different chapters, because he comes out with a new chapter, sometimes 6 months later, sometimes 2 weeks later, who knows? So, and then he's had different topics where he's talked to a bunch of people from ESPN, or he's had 6 episodes on the movie Almost Famous.
Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Curb Your Enthusiasm, thank you. And then there's been a few others which escape my mind at the moment. But it's, when the topic's something that I like, it's quite interesting. So I haven't liked all of the seasons, but I've liked the ones that I've listened to. And there hasn't been a new one in about 6 months now, but hopefully there will be a new one soon. I don't know.
It's a good podcast, actually. I mean, I really enjoyed the Curb Your Enthusiasm. It was great, honestly. And the ESPN, where they could sort of give you like an inside look at sort of what goes on behind the scenes at ESPN, and it's well done. So number 2 for me, Josh, you've already mentioned it, and that's Serial. And I specifically am counting it as Serial season 1 only. Season 2 was trash, and season 3 was okay. Like, have you listened to season 2 and season 3? Or?
Yeah, I've listened to all of them, yes.
I mean, I really didn't like season 2 at all. Season 3 was okay. But season 1 season 1 of Serial is probably like the podcast most responsible for like the podcast boom. Like, now we talked about how Joe Rogan, got all this money from Spotify, and there's all these people like with making tons of money by making their show exclusive, and podcast is becoming so huge. And I really feel like season 1 of Serial is like really has a fair share of the responsibility in that boom of podcasting. It was so compelling, like you said. I like the way you put it. The case that they covered was so unique. The story of Adnan Syed, who's still in jail as far as I know. He's been in jail since like 1997, I think it takes place, the murder. So it's really just, I mean, if you haven't listened to Serial season 1, I mean, you're missing out, honestly. Do you remember, like, I think the show used to come out on Fridays. I don't remember. It came out a specific day of the week. Each new episode would come out, and I would listen to it immediately when it was released, and then I would listen to it again right after. Like, I would listen to it right away. Listen to it twice. It was so compelling. Like, honestly, I don't think we'll come across a podcast like that again. At least not for a while.
So a few things I want to say about Serial. First of all, I think it is the most downloaded podcast of all time. Number 1. Number 2.
That makes sense.
Number 2, you were saying how you would always listen to it as soon as it came out. So I didn't even know about this show until like weeks or months later. So basically there were 12 episodes in season 1. I listened to the first 6 episodes while driving from Toronto to Montreal in the car straight through. And then I listened to the next 6 episodes, the last 6, while driving back from Montreal to Toronto. So that's how I listened to it.
That's a binge right there. That's solid.
Yeah. Then the last thing I'll say about Serial is that it has, and at least in season 1, it did have like the best theme music of any podcast I've ever listened to.
This is a Global Cal-Link prepaid call from
Adnan Syed,
an inmate at a Maryland Correctional Facility.
From This American Life and WBEZ Chicago, it's Serial, one story told week by week. I'm Sarah Koenig.
Oh, it's so well done. And also the host, Sarah Koenig, she's so good at telling the story. That's part of the I don't want to say the charm. Charm's the wrong word. It's like part of what makes the show so compelling, you know?
Right.
So, yeah, great show, honestly. So I can't wait to hear what your number one is.
Number one.
So number one, you've already mentioned it, and it's the ongoing history of new music with Alan Cross. So,
Oh, that's your number one.
yeah, well, because ever since I discovered it, I mean, I told you that I used to listen to this thing on the radio before podcasts even existed. And I was always frustrated when I would turn on the radio and I'd miss half the show, or I'd miss the whole show or whatever. And back then, it's not like you could just go listen to things on demand. So when I discovered that it became a podcast, and not only that, but I could go back and listen to old episodes, I was thrilled. So, you know, I don't love every single topic that he talks about, but most of them are quite interesting. And it's not like it's a daily thing. So I feel like, oh my God, I'm behind. I have to listen to yesterday's episode and the episode from 2 days ago. It only comes out once, sometimes twice a week. And so it's, and the episodes are not that long. They're, 30 to 40 minutes, which is great. And also you mentioned something about Sarah Koenig and how she's good at telling a story. Alan Cross is very good at telling stories as well. So, and he knows his music. Like, he really just knows his music.
He's an encyclopedia of music. I mean,
so that's my favorite podcast.
All right. So I guess you can probably guess my number one, and maybe you're going to be disappointed in me, but it is the Tony Kornheiser Show.
I'm not disappointed.
Before. I felt like I had to put it at number one. It deserves the spot at number one because, like you said, we've been listening to this show for at least 10 years. Like, it's had various formats, right? It's really only been a sort of true podcast maybe the last 2 or 3 years. Before that, it was a podcasted version of Tony's local radio show, right? Like, that he would do in Washington, D.C. And it was still basically the same type of show. Like, it's not much has changed other than sort of like the origin of it. But it's just it's a great show. Tony is charming in his way. It's about sports, but it's about life. It's about his misadventures as this old man that he is now. It's funny because I was thinking about it. Like, people may listen to our podcast and say, oh, the Tony Kornheiser Show, Skip and Josh, they both really like that show. Maybe I should give it a try. I guarantee you it's the type of show that new listeners cannot get into.
No, you do need a lot of insider information to enjoy the show. Like, if you've listened for the last decade like us, there's a lot of inside jokes that you'll get. And if you haven't, you won't.
There's so many inside jokes. There's so much like terminology, like the littles, like all these words that they've made up over the years, Dr. Hoffwaff, and like, this is just off the top of my head, like, and this obviously doesn't mean anything to our listeners, so I'm not going to spout off any more of that stuff, but like, there's tons of inside jokes and inside information that you just, over the years, them, and then but there's definitely a barrier for new listeners, right? And I don't think he cares because he probably has enough of a loyal following, like, to be able to keep producing his podcast.
And that's the thing. Ever since he became his own podcast and left the radio station, he doesn't have to follow anyone's rules anymore. He could do whatever he wants, which, that's everyone's dream, just to do whatever they want. Like, that's what we do. But the drawback of that is sometimes he talks about things that, other than him and his son, no one else cares about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, they talked about Tiger Woods a lot this week, and I knew they would talk about it a lot because he's into golf. Michael, his son, it could be a golf analyst, like, this is important to them. So they talked about it. But like, let me tell you, I fast forwarded, like, I just skipped past Tiger Woods this week when he was talking about it. I was like, I'm not listening to this again. So that's my list, the Tony Kornheiser Show. That's number one.
Nice. And then listen, I had it at number 5. I could have easily put it higher on my list because you're right. It's basically been a part of my life every day for the last decade. So I maybe should have put it higher up, but whatever. It was on my list.
I mean, I still listen to it every time it comes out. Like you said, it's not every day. Now it's like 3 times a week or 2 times a week, whatever he feels like doing. And I listen to it right away. It's like, it's something that I listen to without hesitation, so it's like, Tony's like, our old friend, he's like our old friend, or maybe our our weird uncle, that we like to listen to on the radio, basically.
The Skip and Josh podcast is available wherever you listen to podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. If you listen to the show through Apple Podcasts, please leave a review. To interact with the show, send an email to skipandjoshshow@gmail.com. Follow the show on Twitter @skipandjosh, and go to facebook.com/skipandjosh to like the show page. To see links mentioned on today's episode, go to skipandjosh.com. And now for some final thoughts from the guys.
Okay, so I have a question for you that has nothing to do with podcasts.
Sure.
Did you watch any of those outdoor hockey games that were played in Lake Tahoe?
Well, I mean, I didn't even know that there was... I didn't even know, though, that there was games in Lake Tahoe until like 2 days before when you told me that there was, right? Like, I had no idea. It was so like... It just goes to show when there's outdoor games and your team's not in them, you don't know. But you texted me during the was on and you said, this looks really cool. So I turned it on and I was like, yeah, this looks really cool. And then I turned it off. And then I found out later that the ice melted and they had to postpone it.
Well, the only reason I mention it is because I watched a bit of the game and I didn't care who won the game. But because of that event, I discovered something that I was not aware of. The Vegas Golden Knights have two, not one, but two mascots.
Well, as you know, we're a mascot-friendly show, so I didn't know. What are their mascots?
One of them is called, and you'll like this, Chance the Gila Monster.
Okay.
No relation to Chance the Rapper. And
right.
The other one, the other mascot is called the Golden Knight, which that one makes sense actually.
Oh, he's like a knight. Okay, so it's like they have like a mascot for kids and a mascot for adults.
I suppose, I don't know, but anyway, I just found it interesting that they have two mascots. Some teams don't even have one, and they have two.
Yeah, that is weird. I mean, look, it was a gorgeous setting, and I don't know if the NHL screwed up or what, but it was weird that the ice melted and they had to postpone.
Well, when I told you that there was going to be a game in Lake Tahoe, my first question to you was, is it not warm in Lake Tahoe?
But it is warm, and you saw people in their kayaks in the lake.
Right.
Right? So obviously it wasn't that cold, but it is known as this place where you can go skiing and you can go swimming in the same day, So I figured it's cold enough, and you'd figure that the NHL would have do their due diligence on the ice. I mean, I don't know. I guess it was a little bit hotter than they expected. So they did the second game at night, right? The next day?
Well, they did
during the day?
The first game, they finished the first game at night, like 8 hours later. And then the second game, they pushed it back like, I guess, 3 hours later than it was supposed to start or something.
Yeah, it was the strength of the sun that caused it.
Right. Anyway, no big deal.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, we were talking about podcasts. So I do want to mention a new podcast that I listened to this week, which is called Renegades Born in the USA. And this is a podcast which is a Spotify exclusive, and it features Barack Obama, former U.S. president, and Bruce Springsteen, an unlikely duo. I listened to the first 2 episodes, and the third one's coming out this week, and it's a really good listen. It's serious. It's not about music. It's more about the state of the nation. But it's still worthwhile listen. They're both great speakers and storytellers.
So you have to pay for that?
No. You can get it on the podcast version of the free version of Spotify. You can get podcasts without paying.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Something that happened this week that I thought was really funny.
Mm-hmm.
I don't watch the NBA at all, but if you do watch the NBA and you were watching, let's say on Friday, I think just last night actually, Oklahoma City was playing against Atlanta. I don't know if you heard about this, but you know how in the NBA, every team seems to have like 17 different uniforms these days.
Yeah.
So the game, I think, was in Oklahoma. And so Atlanta was wearing their road red uniform.
Yeah.
And Oklahoma was wearing their orange uniform.
Oh, Lord.
And if you saw, like, you could barely tell who was on which team.
You have to wonder sometimes about who makes these decisions because it's ridiculous,
Well, it's funny you mention that because the league has this thing called a uniform selection system. And so there was a glitch and which allowed this to happen. And the interesting thing was that Oklahoma at halftime changed into their white uniform, which
Halftime.
makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense. But my question is, why did they wait until halftime to do that?
Right. Maybe they didn't have the jerseys there and the equipment manager had to rush to get them.
No, because the game was in Oklahoma. Like, they have everything at their disposal there.
It's so weird.
So anyway, I just thought that was hilarious and I wanted to mention it.
So, Josh, I just wanted to end the show. I promised that I do a little shout out. We met a couple of podcasters this week, these guys from the show called the Hot Sauce Sports Show, and they did an interview with none other than David Sampson, who's persona non grata here in Montreal. And their interview's out. It's a good listen. It's a little bit friendly towards David Sampson, more than I think how you feel, how I feel. But nonetheless, it's still, for Expos fans, it's still a good listen. So I'll put the link in the description.
Yeah, I was. You sent me the link and I listened to it, and I actually forwarded the link to another friend of ours. Yeah. There really wasn't anything that I heard on the episode that I didn't already know. Yeah. Because Dave Sampson was a guest about a year ago on Ariel Helwani's show, and a lot of the same information was discussed. I just thought that while these guys seem like really nice guys, I don't know the names of the hosts of the show, but I felt that they were a little too easy on him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you have like someone who's a little bit more famous as an interview and you're sort of an indie podcast, maybe it's tough to ask those tough questions. I don't know. Anyways, but like I said, if you're still interested in the ancient history of the Montreal Expos and what went down with the demise of the franchise, I'll put the link out there for everybody to listen to. So, Josh, you're going to ask me, what are we talking about next week?
What are we talking about next week?
Well, I have a topic that I'd like to do, but I'm afraid that it's going to scare you because it requires a lot of effort.
I had a feeling that would be the case.
So, how do you feel about your favorite song lyrics?
Well, I don't really have a list of that.
I know. That's why it requires a lot of work. You got to think of some songs that have a great lyric that you like. I mean, as always, I have an idea. I have 2 or 3 that came to mind this week, and I said this would be a great topic. So,
all right. Well, I will do my homework, and I'll come up with at least 7 of them.
Well, I mean, obviously, it's not going to be the greatest lyrics of all time. It's like our favorites. So, basically, I'm going to choose some artists that I like and songs that I like, and I'm going to grab the best lyrics that I can.
Okay. It's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. So, another week. I'll talk to you next week.
All right. Have a great week.
You too.